So at this period of time in our Hebrew Bible readings, we're talking about King David over the next few weeks. And King David is a character that has fascinated and continues to fascinate. There are still books being written, TV series, movies on this theme. And it's difficult to talk about him because I'm personally pretty confused about him. And by the end of this sermon, I expect that you will be confused too. Just kidding. Actually, not. See, there are so many stories about David, more pages about David than any other Bible character, if you include the Psalms. So who is David? Well, he's the champion of Israel versus Goliath and the Philistines. But when he had a falling out with Saul, he became a mercenary for the same Philistines. He was chosen by God to be king, or was he? Because in practice, he plotted against his benefactor, Saul. He was known as being faithful to God, except on those occasions when he really wasn't. He was apparently a consummate politician because somehow God's will always intertwined with political expediency. He unified Judah and the northern tribes, but that only lasted for 2 reigns, about 100 years. He was surely a great king and the father of the Israel state. But by the end of his life, he was under attack from his own sons. He was held up as an example for Hebrew men for generations. And yet, quite frankly, David was a sexual predator. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up thinking that David must be a good guy because he's written about in the Bible, so he must be a good guy. But probably he is the most complex character ever known in history. If you think about it, his life stories are one long soap opera, more twists and turns than a Shakespeare tragedy. And perhaps one of the reasons for this is we have to remember that there are so many sources for these stories. This book of Samuel was written down probably about 1,500 years after David reigned. So many different writers contribute to this biblical text that we have as we know it, and some obviously were strongly pro-David, and others, as you think about it, seem to be opposed to the cult of David. Therefore, the depiction in our stories is inconsistent. And as we've said so many times, this shows the danger of trying to read the Bible as history. 2 Samuel is less of a biography than it is, in fact, a book of short stories. But one thing that does shine through about David is that he was larger than life, that he's really in many ways one of the early people that demonstrated what we now call charisma. He's been compared, for those of us of a certain generation, to John F. Kennedy, somebody who caught people's imagination, yet quite possibly betrayed the people who backed him in the first place, and we know for sure that he betrayed his wife. And you remember the whole court around Kennedy was known as Camelot. And I often think that a better comparison with David was that of King Arthur, a legendary king of the Britons who vanquished all enemies, who died after internal feuding, yet the myth goes, will return to bring glory in the country's hour of need. And that's certainly part of the legend of David, isn't it? That in this case, that his descendant, Jesus of Nazareth, would come in the country's hour of need. And one of the lenses in which to look at these stories is to remember that the Hebrew Bible narrative is that the Israelites were God's chosen people. They were, after all, given the promised land. Yet if you read through the extent of the Hebrew Bible, the only time they really fulfill that destiny as a united kingdom of the tribes of Israel is under David and Solomon, after which it all falls apart again. So it's hardly surprising, isn't it, that the Hebrew writers would put David on a pedestal. So today's story is about the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Leading up to this, in chapter 5, we've learned that David has consolidated Judah and the northern tribes and has now moved the capital from Saul's stronghold in Hebron to the north to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was originally the home of the Jebusites, not a Hebrew town at all. But David chose this town and gave it his name. So this is a symbol of a significant power shift from Saul to David, from north to south. But perhaps there was something lacking to establish David's city as the legitimate capital. So what if the Ark of the Covenant were located in Jerusalem? That would show, wouldn't it, that this was God's will. The problem was that the Ark was miles away in Kiriath Jearim at the house of a priest called sorry, I can't see this word very well, Abinadab. Previously, the Philistines had captured the Ark, but they immediately started having a whole string of bad luck, so they sent it back to the Israelites. But unfortunately, you still had to go through Philistine territory to get to Abinadab's house. So we've learned David picked a fight with the Philistines, which great warrior that he was, of course he won. So now he's ready to go get the Ark. He takes with him, we hear, 30,000 followers, and off they go to bring it back, singing and dancing all the way. Now, there's a piece in this story that is missing from the lectionary reading that we heard this morning, and it's one of the aspects of the Revised Common Lectionary that they tend to leave out all the gory bits, which is nice for us to hear, but it doesn't really tell the story as it is actually laid out in the book of Samuel. So this is the next bit of the story that is actually excluded. So off they go, they're dancing all the way, and then when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen were shaking it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah. So that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care in the city of David. Instead, David took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So it turns out this ark is a mixed blessing. It can be dangerous, as Uzzah found out. And so David gets scared. "I'm not really sure," he says. "I'm not really sure I want this." So he aborts the mission and leaves it behind with Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and takes off home again. But the next thing you know is, all of a sudden, things are going very well for Obed-Edom. The ark is bringing him luck. And what's even more amazing is Obed-Edom is not from one of the tribes of Israel. He is a Philistine. So seeing what good luck this is bringing, David decides to go and get it back again. But this time around, he is being super cautious. And so we hear that they stopped every 6 paces to make a sacrifice, to make sure that nothing went wrong this time. And finally, then, the ark arrives in Jerusalem to great fanfare. And we hear that David is so excited, he's dancing his socks off, literally, because he's only wearing a linen ephod. Now, an ephod is a sort of a loincloth. And interestingly, that is traditionally a priestly garment. Is David even entitled to wear it? He was, after all, anointed king, but not necessarily anointed priest. And now he's dancing so wildly in this ephod that he even exposes his private parts. And when this happens, his wife, Michal, is less than impressed, crudely exposing himself to any woman, even of the lowest classes. And here's another section of the story that is missed out of our reading that I've shared with you. So after this happens, David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible with this, and I will be abased in my own eyes. But by the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So we're reminded that this wife of David, of whom he had very many, this wife was Michal, was Saul's daughter. So you can imagine that his response to her criticism that, God chose me over your father probably didn't go down very well. He says, "I'm dancing before the Lord, and don't you ever forget that the Lord chose me over your dad." So there. And not surprisingly, that's the end of that marriage. They no longer sleep together, and Michal never has children. So is that a domestic falling out? But just think about it a little bit more. Michal is Saul's daughter. If she had a son by David, that son would have an overwhelming claim to the throne. He might even plot against his father when he got older. As you know, another son, Absalom, actually did. And that's not the master plan, to have part of Saul's line continue in the Davidic line. So the breakup with Michal also has political ramifications as well. So for me, this is an example of an apparently simple story, just bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, that has so many layers. Was David's intent to honor the God of the Ark and restore the covenant made with Moses? Or was his intent simply to consolidate his own political power? And then halfway through, he starts to wonder whether it's even worth it if the Ark has the power to kill people who aren't entitled to touch it. Perhaps it's too dangerous to have around. Or is it just a good luck charm that will bring David good fortune, like Obed-Edom? And then, when they get into Jerusalem, is David being blasphemous by wearing a priestly ephod? And does he devalue that by his crazy dancing? Is the row with Michal just because she's disgusted by his behavior and David doesn't take kindly to criticism? Or is it an explanation as to why the marriage of expediency, the original marriage of expediency to Saul's daughter, was not consummated, so that Saul's hereditary line died out? So, folks, I warned you when I started, that you might end up being just as confused as I am. Because David, as presented in Scripture, is such a complex character. There are so many different layers. One thing is for sure, he was not a saint, but he was surely overwhelmingly human. So knowing that summer is coming along and we've got lots of time on our hands, perhaps less than in COVID times, I'm going to offer you an invitation. I'm going to invite you to read the book, the second book of Samuel, for yourselves. It's not very long. And think about why, in your opinion, David is such an important personality in our scriptures. And then, of course, you have to come back next week to hear the rest of the story. Amen. Thanks, Anne.